Hello, BookTube. I'm Jonathan, and today I want to recommend some sci-fi books to fantasy readers. And in order to do that, I have recruited the modern master of sci-fantasy, author of the Sun Eater series, and just all-around heartbreaker, Christopher Ruocchio.
Hey, man. Thanks for having me on.
I like how much I pumped him up, and it was just a very casual, like, "Hey, good to see you."
Yeah, well, you got my name right? You got the heartbreaker thing down. So
I hit the bullet points that Christopher emailed to me beforehand.
Right.
And joining us is one of my favorite science fiction and fantasy booktubers, a guy that is disproving the stereotype that tall guys can't read. It's Alex from Tall Guy Reads.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me. I'm a big fan of these collabs that you do with all the different booktubers and excited to be a part of one.
Awesome, man. Well, what we are going to do, we each have 3 recommendations. This is why you've clicked on the video. You've clicked on the video for Christopher, so I'm going to put you on the spot. What is your first sci-fi book recommendation for a fantasy reader?
Okay, so I am going to subvert expectations and not say the one everyone's thinking I'm going to say. I'll save that for the end. My first recommendation is Shards of Honor by Lois McMaster Bujold. It's the first in a very long series of hers, the Vorkosigan saga, which is hard to spell. But Shards of Honor is the first book. It's not super representative of the whole series because it is about a lady named Cordelia Naismith, who is sort of a Federation starship captain, right? Who gets sort of lost behind enemy lines, fighting the Baryaran Empire, which is sort of space czarist Russian empire, right? The planet Baryar had been connected to the wormhole network, sort of connects the whole galaxy together, but had then been cut off from that connection for a couple hundred years, I think. And so it slid back into being kind of medieval, and then it gets reconnected, gets invaded by another bigger empire. It was just one planet, so it's an empire, but it's just one planet. And they have recently tried to annex a couple new planets and start expanding. The Federation, not super up on this, but it is also a bit of a strange pick here because Shards of Honor is also a romance novel. It is about her falling in love with a Baryaran officer, across enemy lines, right? And them trying to sort of smooth that whole situation over. The series, as it goes on, becomes about their son. A little bit of a spoiler, but it's kind of the pitch for the whole series. Miles, who is my favorite, leading character in any science fiction series. Miles is a blast. I think that a lot of fantasy readers who are afraid to get into science fiction are afraid of techno babble, and they're annoyed that science fiction isn't enough about character. Lois is all about character all the time. There's still some good sci-fi techno stuff, right? But she's character forward. If you are missing that from fantasy, and especially if you like court politics and that stuff, she's the best. It's the most award-winning science fiction series of all time. It's got 5 or 6 Hugos back when those were sort of something everybody cared about. And it's a great series. So they're I think about 20 books, and none of them are very long. So it's a great way to get into science fiction out of fantasy. So.
Wow. I like that pitch. It's got interesting world building, character focus. The books are short, so they're easy to pick up. Now, I have read one book from the series. I started with the Vor game. I was told you can read them out of order. Christopher told me that was a terrible idea. What were you doing reading the Vor game?
So I know Lois, and Lois says this herself, and I think that she is dead wrong. I think that we need to read them in order. And this is one of those times where I would recommend reading them in universe chronological order and not publication order, because she would go back and she would write something from an earlier chapter in these characters' lives. She would go back and write another prequel about Miles' mother, Cordelia, right? And I think the best way to read them is actually in story order, not in the order they were released. So I would start with Shards of Honor. There is one book in the universe that's set earlier. It's called Falling Free, but it's totally standalone. It's not related to the main plot. All of the other books deal with Cordelia and her husband Errol and their son Miles, and that's sort of the main thrust of the series. So.
I like it. Well, learn from my mistakes. Don't do what I did, because I liked it, but I didn't love it. But maybe I would have loved it if I had read the books leading up to it. Alex, have you read any of Vorkosigan?
I've not. No, it's on my list, my very long list, but yeah, I've not read it yet.
Yeah, Christopher might have just bumped it up the list a little bit for you.
Oh, Absolutely.
Yeah, no, it's a blast. It really is, and it's not a huge commitment. It's not like trying to get into Gene Wolfe or myself, God forbid. But they are a lot faster, a lot lighter, a lot easier to read. But they're also still like pretty.
Awesome.
They can hit pretty hard at times, right? Because you're spending because like I said, it's so character driven, right? That the sort of the more time you spend with these people across books, right? She has to lift a lot less weight for each emotional impact because you're so used to these people by book 9 that she's able to really deliver some really strong character moments and some fun stuff with the science too. So it's a really great, I think, transitional read.
I love it. All right, Alex, what is your first recommendation?
All right, so I know some people might pick this apart for being not technically sci-fi, but I'm going to go with The Stand by Stephen King. And I'm going to call it sci-fi in this case because, at its core, it's about a bioengineered influenza virus that escapes from a lab accidentally and then causes a apocalyptic level event that wipes out a significant amount of the population. And what it starts is basically a good versus evil quest-like story with a huge cast of characters and a lot of incorporation of paranormal, supernatural, like prophecy, and there's a lot of things that we love about fantasy in it. So I see when some people say it's a total mash of fantasy and science fiction and horror. It definitely is all three of those. I think for me, it might be something that a lot of fantasy readers, if they've never really been exposed to Stephen King, might not pick up, just because they'll probably associate it with horror. But I think in addition to being the sci-fi post-apocalyptic type novel, struggle for survival, it's a fantasy story, it's a quest story, and there's just some really great characters that will pretty unforgettable in a lot of instances, and some great scenes, and it might lead you to reading more of King's books, which are secretly science fiction in a lot of cases. So yeah.
I like this recommendation because I want to read The Dark Tower next year, and I focus on sci-fi for the channel, and so I'm trying to kind of, I know it's kind of fantasy, horror, western, but there's some sci-fi in there. It counts. So this is just like another little tool in my excuse belt that Alex said that Stephen King includes fantasy in a lot of his books.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sci-fi. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, science fiction. Yeah.
Christopher, have you read The Stand?
So I have not. The only Stephen King I have read is The Shining, because
really good one.
Like one of the few books. My dad wasn't a big reader, but he had the paperback of that, so I read everything in the house of it, right? But I've never really done the deep dive on the Stephen King thing. But I do. What I like about him, right, by reputation, is that he is this inheritor of like the old weird fiction mantle, right? Like back in the day, like people thought of Lovecraft as a fantasy writer. Now everybody thinks of him as maybe horror first, science fiction second, and fantasy like not at all. But he was considered a fantasy writer, broadly speaking, for a long time.
Yeah.
And King is sort of an inheritor of like that brand of fiction, and I think that's partially due to the fact that he's like a mainstream writer, right? He's not like he doesn't come to sci-fi conventions and hang out with losers like me, right? Like he's a writer that like your grandma heard of, right? He's like a real writer in quotes, and because of that, I think he's been sort of isolated from a lot of the like sort of micro genre fence building that science fiction and fantasy writers have been doing over the last several decades. So he's like, I could put a robot in my fantasy horror story. That's fine. I can do whatever I want. Actually. And that's sort of like more in keeping with like Lovecraft, right, or like Clark Ashton Smith, or the kind of guys he was growing up reading, and I think that's pretty cool because that's the way it used to be, So
yeah, absolutely. That's why one of the big reasons why I like him a lot, because he's kind of like a palate cleanser in a lot of ways, especially despite The Stand being incredibly long. It's just like one of the longest books I ever read. And I wouldn't call it a palate cleanser, but I think if you're reading a lot of fantasy and you want something different that has, at its core is a sci-fi element in the story and how it's developed, that it could be a really good option for you to check out something new.
Yeah, I need to read more King. My sister kindly gifted me it, and I don't really read horror, watch much horror. I'm like, it's too scary for me. I don't know. I'm I'm going to try The Dark Tower, The Stand. 11/22/63 is high on my Stephen King list, and then we'll see if I become a fan. I'll try some of the scarier books. Okay, well, my first recommendation is Spin by Robert Charles Wilson. So in this book, it's set in sort of present, near future. One day, all the stars disappear, and there's this mystery of why did they disappear, who did it, what was the reason behind it, and what does that mean for people, Earth, society, that all of the stars have gone. And a reason that I think this might appeal to fantasy readers is that it introduces something something that I really enjoy about a lot of sci-fi is that sense of wonder. It has this kind of mystery that kind of takes place on such a massive scale. It's kind of a really kind of like mind-opening book. But it does so with a fairly character-based approach. I don't think it's the best characters ever written, but if you're someone that's a bit worried about trying sci-fi because you've heard some things about Asimov or Clarke or whatever that don't really focus on the characters, these characters are pretty good. They are kind of put in boxes a little bit. You have the person like, oh, this one's the science person, this one's the more spiritual focused person, but there is a really great relationship dynamic between the main three characters. And so I think that'll kind of pull you along as you kind of get introduced to the sci-fi stuff, and hopefully it hooks you in like me, because this was just a real sense of wonder read for me. I absolutely love Spin.
Awesome. Yeah, I haven't read that one.
Yeah, I haven't either.
It came out around, I think, 2004, 2005, and I think it won a Hugo, so somewhat modern. I'd recommend it for all sci-fi and fantasy readers.
Awesome.
All right, Christopher, back to you, my friend. What is your second recommendation?
Okay, so I'm going to recommend Revelation Space by Alistair Reynolds. I'm a big Alistair Reynolds fan. And so this isn't like, this isn't like if you're not a big reader at all, like this might be kind of the deep end. And don't worry, like the next one's going to be an even deeper end book. But if you are like, a pretty hardcore fantasy reader, especially if you like the heavier, like darker stuff, right? If you're a Stephen Erickson fan, if you are, like a Game of Thrones fan or something like that, and you want it darker, right? To reference Leonard Cohen, then Reynolds is great. But he also, like, this is like hard science fiction. Like it is serious world building, right? That like plays with science. But Alistair Reynolds used to work for the European Space Agency, right? Like he is like science first, but without forgetting the fiction part. So they're actually like hand in hand, as opposed to like I'm fiction first, science second, right? And so if you like really you want to try science fiction, but you want to be sure you're trying science fiction and you're not, just sort of cheating, right? Dipping your toe in. He would be a great choice. Revelation Space is set, I think it's about 1,000 years from now, so it's not that far in the future. But it is, it's in a world that doesn't have faster than light travel, right? So all the spaceships take a while to get places. And as a consequence, it's really only the nearby stars that have been settled, and they're all real stars, and the travel times are like totally accurate, right? and that adds a level of realism and a cool factor that you lose in stories even like mine, right? Which are just sort of more on the Star Wars end of the spectrum. And so I really, I really admire writers that I'm not like Reynolds, right? Because I don't do this sort of thing. But at the same time, if you like the really complex sort of Baroque world building, right? You like the deep, dark, weird stuff that you get with the more out there, like heavy fantasy series, you'll be right at home in Revelation Space, right? So this is, like I said, it's sort of near future, but it's not near future like, tomorrow, right? It's a few hundred years out. Earth is still around, but it's like, broadly speaking, like we've moved on. Like it's not in great shape. It's sort of a mystery story, right? There is this sort of weird, outer space anomaly involving some aliens. There are a lot of different factions that are trying to vie for it, basically, right? And it pits these like three different threads sort of together, and sort of takes you through this really dark sort of future world. And it absolutely sort of blows up in the sequels, right? There's the sort of main trilogy, as it sort of scales up to this big, galaxy scale threat that is going to dismantle like all of human civilization, basically, because it's gotten too big. And, so it's got a little bit in common with like earlier stuff like Clark in that respect, right? But it's still got some pretty strong characters. They tend to mostly be, for want of a better word, evil. Like there are just a lot of like completely amoral, unpleasant characters. But they're so alien. They're still human, but they're like, either they've modified themselves technologically, or they're some sort of weird clone, or they've got some other weird, inventive technological change going on, right? Whether that's biotech or whatever. They're never not colorful, is the point, right? The characters are always like fascinating, but it's usually fascinating because they're quite dark, right? And that can be very fun. I'm particularly fond of his book Chasm City, but I would read that maybe second.
Oh yeah,
it's part of the same universe. He's also got a short story collection set in the same universe. So I think 2 short story collections. So there's a lot to read in that setting. So if you want a darker, right, and if you want to really get the science with your fiction and make sure you're eating your vegetables, this is definitely a good place to get in. But like I said, maybe not like if you're like kind of a more casual reader and you're like, oh, like I want to like pick my first science fiction novel, but it's also like my 4th novel ever. Maybe not the best jumping in point, but if you're sort of a fantasy veteran, I would consider it as a crossover.
Yeah, I like the hard sci-fi recommendation to get you that cred. You're like, all right, I need to kind of make a splash with the sci-fi crowd. I'm not coming in with any sci-fantasy, any soft sci-fi. I'm going straight to Revelation Space.
Yeah. Oh, it's so good though. Have either of you read it?
No, I have that and House of Suns I want to get to.
Yeah, so that's what I haven't read. I was so obsessed with the Revelation Space stuff that I just like stuck with it. So I haven't gotten out of Revelation Space with Alistair Reynolds.
Yeah.
But I love that guy. He like I said, I like writers that I am not like, and like boy, like I don't have the education to do some of the stuff that he does with the technology. It's just absolutely wild. So
yeah,
I have read 3 Reynolds books. I've read Chasm City, which I really liked. Aversion, his latest one, which I really liked. And House of Suns is one of my all-time favorite books. So Revelation Space is on the schedule for 2023. I'm going to try and get Alex to join me. Well,
I would love to, if I can.
We got 2 votes for it right here. We'll see.
Awesome.
We'll make him squeeze it in there. Comment below. Make Alex read Revelation Space. All right, Alex, what is your second recommendation?
My second recommendation is Hyperion by Dan Simmons, and I think there are multiple reasons for this. One, I think right off the bat, this is kind of dipping your toes into hard science fiction while still remaining on the outskirts, because for this first book specifically in this duology, which is then 4 books, is way more character driven than the sequel. And so what it's really about is 7 pilgrims get sent to the planet of Hyperion on this possibly fatal mission where they have to go to the time tombs, which are these mysterious tombs that connect different periods of time and are moving backwards into time. And you have they're trying to confront the Shrike, which is this like cosmic being that is all super powerful and dangerous and mysterious, and they're trying to figure out more about him. And basically it's kind of inspired by the Canterbury Tales, or it is inspired by the Canterbury Tales and how it's told, with each pilgrim telling their story of why they're there, what they're looking for to get out of this pilgrimage, and so on. And I think one of the things that I like about it is what I think is really cool about fantasy, in that it kind of blends this imaginative world building that you see in so many fantasy series out there, with a look at the human condition side of it. So just an actual look at humanity, what we are underneath everything on the outside, what our flaws are, what our strengths are. And I think a lot through the stories that are told in this first book, you get a really good look at just the human condition and humanity at the most basic level, in these like kind of really dire straits in some of the stories. And I think 2 of the stories specifically that are in here are some of the best short fiction, I would consider them, isolated short fiction that I've read in a long time specifically. And I think The Priest and the Scholar's Tale are my two that I just think are ridiculously good, and I just think it's a story that a lot of people will resonate with, a lot of people will connect with, and even though there is a lot of sci-fi techno jargon, I think, thrown at you right from the get-go, it kind of fades into the background, at least in this first book, and you're really focused on the characters. And I think as fantasy readers, a lot of fantasy readers are really, they like really well-developed characters and character-driven stories, and I think that this has all of that. And it also leads to the sequel, which, if you are looking for more science fiction, the sequel of Fall of Hyperion absolutely goes right full tilt into that, where it kind of goes steps away from the structure of Hyperion and goes full science fiction. And I think, some people may read the first one and hate the second one, or vice versa, but I think they work well together. And I just think it's it's a very interesting, very interesting duology. And I think it is very good. I think a lot of fantasy readers especially will enjoy it.
Christopher, I'm pretty sure you're a fan of Hyperion. A, because you've said it before, and B, because I feel like a bit of a Hyperion influence in some elements in Sunita. What are some of the elements that you like? Hyperion?
So the primary one actually is one that's sort of maybe not obvious to people actually, which is that it is from Dan Simmons. That I learned that you could reference other things, and that was cool actually. Because one of the things that I like about Hyperion so much, sort of in contradistinction to Dune, which I love Dune. I'm not going to mention Dune because everybody knows, right? Like that's a good choice for what we're talking about. But in Dune, right, the future pulse time is totally disconnected from ours, right? There's maybe a couple references. But Hyperion is deeply informed by our present, right? And a lot of the basically all of the references, right, are things that are to things that are real, right? A lot of the place names matter, right? Like even the police force on Mars was the John Carter Brigade or something, right? So there's a lot of these neat little references in the Detective's Tale, right? All of the internet jargon is literally just ripped from Neuromancer, word for word, right? So the internet works exactly the same way as it works in Neuromancer, which is super cool. And I think they talk about cowboys and ice and stuff, and I think Gibson gets a shout out directly, right, which is very, very cool. And then John Keats is a character, right? And John Keats is my favorite poet, so that kind of works for me. But so I really I learned that it's okay to do that, right? It is okay to borrow William Gibson's ideas and just have the internet work that way, and people will be like, oh cool, Neuromancer, and that's fine. Or they will have the opposite response, as people have had the opposite response to certain of the things that I've borrowed in my own work, and they'll be like, that's stupid, make up your own ideas, nerd. And what I like about Hyperion, right, is that it situates itself in the broader literary tradition, right, by being a part of not just the history, right? There's a bit where he'll talk about Maynard Gladstone being Lincoln or Churchill or 3 other people that he made up, right? And we're oh cool, this is our future, and it's actually tightly connected. But he also situates it, in this literary sense, right? Martin, who is my favorite character, because he is just such a blast, is a poet, right? And he talks about publishing, and I feel that very strongly. That is actually that whole stuff with his editor, it's pretty accurate. Except for maybe the outlandish outfit, but in any case, it makes all this made up literature part of the tradition, right? And Martin's talking about Huck Finn and Beowulf and all of that stuff, and he doesn't treat that any differently than he treats the sci-fi he references, right? It's science fiction is literature, right? It belongs in this big story of human art, right? And that's part of what Hyperion is about. But at the same time, it is about terrifying horror stories in the jungle and detective stories, and whatever the Soldier's Tale was about. You know what I mean? But there's really cool, they're fighting the oh gosh, what are they called? The ousters, right? There's really cool action scenes and stuff like that. So I think it does a bit of everything. And I am with you, Alex. I think Fall of Hyperion is awesome, actually. The Endymion book,
I love it.
Let's go.
not as much, but Fall is great.
Yeah.
And everybody who says differently, I guess, doesn't like John Keats enough. And they should fix themselves.
Very heavy Keats.
I think this is a great pick because I think this is going to hit on a lot of things that fantasy readers might be used to, might be looking for in terms of the world building, characters. The prose is wonderful, but it's also going to throw in some cool sci-fi ideas, some kind of that harder sci-fi stuff as well. And I think it could be a good entryway. And I like the whole series. The Fall of Hyperion is my favorite. And I have a question for you guys because recently I talked to Whitney from the Secret Source of Storycraft, and she loves Hyperion as well, but she doesn't love the cover. The original one that you'll find on the mass market paperbacks of Hyperion is my number one cover. Is my favorite cover of all time. Whitney didn't like it, so she said, put it to a vote in the comments. I was like, oh, I'm going to win this in a landslide. It was pretty 50-50 on whether people liked it or not, so I really need you two to kind of be tiebreakers here. Do you guys like that original Hyperion cover?
The one with the Shrike and the boat on the sea of grass?
Yes.
It's awesome. But
yes.
I love that cover. It's
covers, you know?
Yeah, that's why I bought the book years ago for the first time. I knew nothing about it. It was just like, that cover is awesome.
Yeah,
so I bought
me
it.
too. All right, I'm gonna have to tally it up. I think I might be ahead about 52 to 48. Counting your votes.
Over.
We'll see. Awesome. All right. Well, my second recommendation is one that I think will appeal to Sun Eater fans. It is Deathstalker by Simon R. Green.
Oh yeah.
So this is a fun sci-fantasy, pulpy, kind of trashy, really fun adventure where we follow a character named Owen Deathstalker, who is part of this kind of powerful family, but he's not really interested in all of the politics. He kind of just wants to read his history books, but he kind of gets pulled into a situation where he becomes outlawed by the Empress. He goes on this kind of getaway adventure and kind of meets a bunch of kind of renegades, mavericks, outlaws. They kind of form an interesting team, and there's just a lot of cool action, cool ideas. Simon R. Green just really throws the kitchen sink at this book. An example that I've given before, but I like to share just as kind of an example of how creative he is. There is a torture device in the book, which is a sphere. They'll put a person in a sphere, and then they will turn a dial, and it fast forwards time. So they'll age you 10 years, and they'll say, tell us what we want to know. And you don't tell them, they'll age you another 20 years. And I was just like, that's wacky and cool and awesome, and the whole book is like that. So if you like people fighting with swords and lasers and stuff in space, with a little bit of tongue-in-cheek approach, I think you're real. I've not really made it sound very similar to Sun Eater. Similar sort of like world and characters kind of as Sun Eater, but a lot more sort of not quite as heavy on the themes and stuff. More of just like a fun adventure. But I think there's enough crossover between the two that I'll defend my own intro to this recommendation.
No. So I have not read the books, but Simon did a story for me in Sword and Planet. And he did a Deathstalker story, and it was the first Deathstalker story he'd written in, I think he said 30 years. So it was very, very cool. And I read that story, and I did not know that it was funny when I asked for it. So I got this comedy story. I had no idea Deathstalker was this hilarious, but it was a blast, right? And you're right. It's totally tongue in cheek. Quite by coincidence, this story is about an ancestor of Owen's named Hadrian.
Really?
And he had no idea. And I didn't say anything. So there are two Hadrians in Sword and Planet, and one of them is Simon's Hadrian.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was very cool. He's a really neat guy. I asked him if he wanted to be in the book because I knew he had this old series, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I'll bring it back." It's funny you mentioned this. I was just reading all the old Tarzans, and I just and he's like, and I think I'm going to read the old John Carters next. And we talked about John Carter for 20 minutes. It was very cool.
Yeah, great book. Best character names: Owen Deathstalker, Valentine Wolf. They just
it gives you a sense of the tone, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure.
It's great.
All right, I think we've looped back around to you, Christopher. What is your third and final book for us?
Okay, this is the obvious one. But this is the the big kids advanced science fiction 301 graduate level. suggestion here, and that's Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. We did it.
Yeah.
I had to mention it.
Check off your bingo boards now.
It is perfect for this sort of this video, right? Because it is superficially a fantasy novel, but it ain't, right? Book of the New Sun is set in the far, far, far future after humanity's galactic empire has fallen apart from sheer exhaustion, and it's set on the planet Earth, but Earth is, totally unrecognizable in a lot of ways, it having been millions of years, right? The sun is going out because some alien agency introduced a black hole into it, and it is slowly eating the mass out of the heart of the sun. It's a micro black hole.
Dang.
And this is a big problem because everybody is dying. And the main character, Severian, is a torturer from, the law enforcement, basically, right? And he is banished from his guild for showing mercy to one of their clients, a woman that he has quite scandalously fallen in love with. And by showing mercy to her, he allows her to commit suicide, right? This is pretty early in the book, so it's part of the pitch. And he is exiled, and in order to save the dignity of the guild, basically. And he goes on a completely insane adventure through this, deeply post-historic, Earth. And there are people who are robots secretly, but he doesn't know what a robot is, so he struggles to describe this to you, the reader. And that's what makes the book difficult, is it is written in Severian's own voice, and Gene is absolutely the master of character and voice, right? And so this reads like an artifact of its time, right? He uses words that you might not understand and you might have to work at. There's literally a companion book that a fan wrote back in the day that is just a dictionary. But they're all real words. He does not go and make up his own words. He finds obscure old words to build the setting. So everything feels very solid and real in a way that a lot of science fiction doesn't, because we're just throwing out, gibberish words that we made up. He does not do that. But it feels like a fantasy novel, right? Especially, something sort of in the Game of Thrones vein, because it's also kind of bleak. It's very political, on one level, but it's got this science fiction under the surface thing. So if you're somebody who likes Steven Erikson, right? Because frequently they get compared. I haven't read Erikson, so I don't know why that is precisely. But I know a lot of people, especially in booktube circles, like Malazan, right? So, or Malazan, however you're supposed to say. And so I feel like this is sort of a natural progression of that, right? It is very difficult, but it's only very difficult to fully understand, right? I don't claim to have squeezed all the juice out of this lemon, but it on a first read is like a fun adventure through this weird world, and it's very out there, right? There's there's some time travel, right? There is maybe some magic, actually, right? Or is it sufficiently advanced science? It's not clear. But there are also robots and like ape people, and it's a blast. For my money, it is my favorite science fiction series. I like it more than Dune. It is second only to Lord of the Rings in my estimation. But it's probably, but Gene Wolfe is, I think, a better writer. Just in terms of sheer sentence construction and craft and how he tells the story. I think he is the best science fiction writer who's ever lived. And so I strongly recommend everybody knows its reputation, especially if you listen to me blab about it. It's difficult, but just try it. It's great. It's absolutely the best.
So I have not read all of the Book of the New Sun. I've read The Shadow of the Torturer, and for me, I definitely see the appeal. I was very intrigued by the world. I think the writing is excellent, and a lot of the sort of literary, historical references. There's just so much to dive into, and I see why people go crazy for this book. For me, the thing that kind of prevented me from really connecting it was Severian, the main character, because I can read books about characters that I don't like, but it's a little bit hard when it's a first-person POV. If you dislike them to the point where you're just not really interested in what happens to them. I almost just want this guy to die and the book to end. So that was a little bit of a hurdle for me, but I would recommend giving it a go, because I know if you do click with it, it's very rewarding. And for the people that have heard, oh, it's maybe too tough a read, I think you can actually read it, at least on a surface level, and it's quite easy to follow it. It's not just like a complete, wall of unreadable text, but it's that kind of subtext, like the layers, the true meaning. It's like, oh, it uses this word, but that word might not think what we think it means in like a modern 2022 within, that world has a different connotation. So there's a lot to kind of unpeel, but I think, don't let the fact that it's kind of a famously hard read put you off from giving it a go, because I think you'll be able to dive right in.
Let me give you an example of the sort of thing I mean real quick, right? He talks about the horses that they're all riding, right? But they have claws. So if you are paying attention, you're like, that's not exactly a horse, is it, Gene? But it is to Severian, right? And so he never feels the need to describe what these horses are, because he knows his audience knows that horses have claws, dummy, right? Like, why would I need to explain to you, that that's what they look like, right? And so there are lots of little things like that, and that's really a flex, right? To not describe these things, and to leave that stuff off the page, because it should be, right? Like, the character would not stop and be like, oh, by the way, horses on Earth have clawed feet, because everybody knows that. And and I love stuff like that. Like, it's a very advanced move. But as far as Severian goes, I totally get it. He's not a very nice man. He gets better. He really does. Okay. But by the end of book 5, he is, I think, much easier to like, because he knows that he's a bad person, and he will own up to being a bad person. But he will also make excuses and, hide what he's done. This is something he has in common with, like, A Clockwork Orange, right? Alex comes across as, like, very sort of, polite and superficially, likable, but he is a monster. Severian is perhaps not quite as bad. That's maybe, right? He's up there. So that can definitely be a stumbling block for people, because he will just assert his worldview and, not countervail himself in any way, right? So that can be off-putting for some people. But again, but I like reading, about people who are very different from me. I don't go to fantasy to, like, read about a bunch of 21st century millennials, right? So I like that about the book, and if you're the right sort of reader, I think it can be a strength.
I might have to come back to the series. I actually liked A Clockwork Orange. That worked for me. So I'm sure I could click with it at some point. I didn't prioritize finishing the series. Sure. There's some other things I want to read, but I'll come back to it.
One of these days, Jonathan.
Yeah, you'll get me. I know Alex is interested.
I'm very interested. I have not read it yet, but it's definitely, like, probably the next big sci-fi series that I have on.
Yeah, let me know. I talk about it all day.
Sounds good.
All right, Alex, your third and final book.
All right, I'm going to rewind the clocks 150 years, I think, is when this came out. The Time Machine by H.G. Wells is my third choice. And I'm going to choose this for a number of reasons. One, it's a pretty simple story. You have your main character who's a time traveler, builds a time machine, goes into the future, 800,000 years into the future, where basically humanity has evolved into two different types of species. You have the Morlocks and the Eloi, I think that's pronounced. Yep. And basically he finds himself in a fish out of water in this whole new world with this new threat, and he's trying to both save himself and return back to his own time, but also finds himself in a position where he might have to help these other people in the future and learn more about himself along the way. And I think for fans of fantasy that like Portal fantasy, where you like the stories where someone is going into a world that they know nothing about, they all of a sudden find themselves in this new world with these new cultures, and they're trying to find themselves in the middle of a struggle between different types of cultures and people trying to either work together or destroy the other person or whatever it may be. I think that this is a very accessible look at that, and one, I think it's the foundation of the time travel story in science fiction. And I just think it's just a very accessible book, but I think has a lot of commentary on the future of humanity and just culture clash and stuff like that. And I just think it's a good one. It's one I haven't read for a while. I've read like an abridged version when I was 6 years old or 7 years old or something, and then read the actual one in high school. And I've always really liked it. I feel like it's a book that a lot of people, most everyone knows about, but a lot of people haven't read the actual, sat down and read it. And I don't know, it's just always worked for me. I could see why it wouldn't, because it is a classic book. It's not written like a modern 21st century science fiction book, but I think if you are looking for that, there's a lot to love in it.
Awesome. Christopher, have you read that one?
Oh yeah. That was one of the first ones I read too. So
yeah.
It's like mandatory. No, so I had a science fiction like literature class in high school. Because I went to one of those weird magnet schools.
That's awesome.
And so, I did actually not have a choice. We read through Wells and Verne, and then we read, a bunch of old stuff. Van Vogt, Asimov, up through to about the 80s, really, because that was about when my teacher had stopped reading them. He was an old school fan. So that's why when I talk about this stuff, I'm like, oh yeah, C.L. Moore. And, the only people who know what I'm talking about are like twice my age, 3 times my age sometimes. And they're like, how do you know?
That's a secret kept for old people.
Yeah.
Which old person told you about
you
our
are
secret?
Not allowed to know that.
Yeah, well, that actually literally happened. I said something, I think on a panel about how much I like C.L. Moore and Lee Brackett. And this older lady comes up to me after and is like, how do you know about them? Like joking, right? It's like, you're too young to know about Lee Brackett. I'm like, she's the best. So it does happen. But no, I will second the time machine. That's you want to start with a foundational text. You could hardly do better.
Yeah.
That or War of the Worlds, I would say.
Oh yeah, the other one.
If you want to pick a Wells, those are the 2 big ones, right? But that's for a good reason. War of the Worlds is awesome.
I love that one.
Yeah, I think Time Machine is a great pick. Especially if you do love classics, then I think you're going to jump right in and love it. Even if you don't, if you're not as much, but you're not so much of a sci-fi reader that's going to want to really kind of pick apart what is the quantum physics that is explaining the time travel. It's like, no, a guy makes a machine and then he goes and learns some stuff about himself and humanity. So if you like that kind of approach to storytelling, and if you like books that are only like 100 and something pages, it's an easy way to dip your toe in the sci-fi waters. So I'm going to take a different approach. I'm going to recommend a book that's 1,000 pages long. It's Pandora's Star by Peter F. Hamilton. So why would I recommend a book that's 1,000 pages long, hard sci-fi space opera, to fantasy readers that may not have read a bunch of sci-fi yet? Well, in the book, essentially some weird stuff is going on in space. They say, you know what, let's put a team together. We're gonna go check that out. There's like a Dyson sphere, all kinds of interesting stuff going on. Who did it? What's going on? What are we gonna find when we get there? What are the repercussions of this gonna be? I think fantasy fans are actually gonna be able to tackle this better than some sci-fi fans, because a lot of sci-fi fans aren't used to reading something that is so long, with so many characters, so many different plot threads. It's like, no, all my Clark books, all of my Vonnegut books, they're 300 pages or less. 300 pages into Pandora's Star, you've maybe just gotten introduced to most of like the main cast, okay? So I'm giving you fantasy readers a lot of credit here. I think you guys can kind of push through that, all the world building, all the description, keep track of that, and then you'll be rewarded. You'll be paid off as you get towards the end of that book. Chapter 18, I think it's one of the best chapters of anything ever written. Like, I really like the book overall. I wouldn't quite put it at the top of my list, but if I was just passing out individual chapters, chapter 18. Even if you hate the book, just skip to chapter 18 and read it. But I think fantasy fans are going to have the patience to really kind of reap the rewards of this epic duology. I'm actually reading the second book right now, Judas Unchained. Really enjoyed the first one. Can't wait to see how the duology finishes. Have either of you read any Peter F. Hamilton?
So I read the first of the trilogy. I forget the title. The one that's got the neutronium alchemy, reality dysfunction. I read the reality dysfunction. It was not my favorite book ever. It's been a long time, so I don't have anything specific to say. I just remember being like, that was like maybe not for me. I think there was like
maybe it's for fantasy fans.
yeah, there you go. So that's about the extent of my exposure to it.
I haven't read any Peter F. Hamilton, but when I was going through, weirdly, because I don't think they're really related in how they tell science fiction. When I was going through the Three Body Problem trilogy, I was looking at just like other science fiction, and that was one of the first one I had not heard of at the time, which was just like a couple months ago, and I was like, wow, this sounds so interesting. So I bought a copy of that first book, and then found a copy of Reality Dysfunction as well at used bookstores. Grabbed those. So hopefully I'll get to those soon. But I've heard great things. I know a few people have been reading those over the last couple of months and really enjoying them.
Yeah, didn't click with me. I know what I was going to say, but I'll still second the recommendation though, because I think that the like British space opera writers, right, who like started big in the 90s and then to today, right? Reynolds is one, right? Hamilton is another. Ian Banks, may rest in peace, is a third. And I could have mentioned Banks too when I was picking my three, because he's awesome. I love the culture books; they're like all great. But I think that sort of group is a pretty good place to start, because they do tend to be like pretty wild on the science end of things, right? They're like pretty involved. They're also really out there. Like there's some crazy stuff in Ian Banks, right? And the same with Hamilton, right? So they're really sci-fi. Like you'll know you're getting your vegetables, as I said, right? But at the same time, I think they're accessible in part because they're more modern, but they tend to have the character focus in a way that like Asimov or Clarke, don't really. Because I think that when people say, "Oh, I don't like science fiction," or "I'm intimidated by it," it's specifically this character issue. And to those people, I would say all you need to do really is avoid Golden Age science fiction. Don't read Asimov. Don't start there. Don't start with Clarke, right? Don't start with Heinlein. Maybe read New Wave, right? Like Frank Herbert, Roger Zelazny would be great. Like Lord of Light. If you're a fantasy reader, check that one out for sure. I won't get into it, but
look at this guy sneaking in a fourth recommendation.
But like just avoid the Golden Age guys, right? So like the new space opera guys, especially the UK ones like Reynolds and Hamilton. I think that would be sort of a good rule of thumb. Just avoid the Golden Age stuff. Even the earlier stuff you could get into, right? Like I think it's older, right? But like Edgar Rice Burroughs hasn't aged that badly. I think you could read A Princess of Mars and have a good time. It's short. I think those are great. So
definitely, I think if you can listen to an epic fantasy author describe every stitching of fabric, you can listen to Peter F. Hamilton talk about enzyme bonded concrete. All right, it's
okay. It's just the magic system.
Exactly.
Just think of it that way. It'll be fine.
Awesome. Well, there you go. Those are 9 sci-fi books for fantasy readers. I think pretty much anybody should like them, whether you like sci-fi, fantasy, whether you like both. But we picked these out specifically for fantasy people looking to try some more sci-fi. Alex, go check out his channel at Tall Guy Reads. Go subscribe. Lots of great sci-fi and fantasy. And Suneater, if you I don't know what I have to do to get you guys to read Suneater, but it is my favorite current series. Book 5, Ashes of Man, just came out. Go pick up Empire of Silence and catch up before the series is finished. Now there's been better time to pick up Suneater than now.
That's true. No, please do. I very wisely did not pick that as one of my options. So
it's actually the correct answer. Like we actually all went 0 for 9. Like that's probably the best choice.
I didn't want to do it. Yeah. So thanks for having me on.
I almost did
read my books. Yeah, I wasn't gonna do that, but no, I do think I think people should check it out if they are fantasy readers. I really think that's who it's for. Because that's what I am first, really, is a fantasy reader. So
there you go. I love it. Alex loves it. Go click all the buttons. You can find more sci-fi content over here.